What makes us human? That's, broadly speaking, the topic for today's discussion. At the heart of this question, I believe, is a search for identity. And that's a pursuit that I think resonates with most, if not all of us. So who am I? Well, I'm a Christian, a scientist with a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and American citizenship. And I'm going to unpack all of that for you in 10 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. So in my opening remarks this evening, I think what I'll really do is just highlight what I see as three major aspects of my identity. And I'll start with my name, Praveen Sethupathy. It's of Sanskrit origin. My family also calls me Raghu, after a great emperor in Hindu mythology, whose line gave rise to Rama, an incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu. Sethupathy means Lord of the Bridge, and the bridge refers to a former chain of limestone shoals that connected the southern tip of India to Sri Lanka. And according to the ancient Hindu epic, the Ramayana, the bridge was constructed by Lord Rama and his army. So I think needless to say, my name is steeped in ancient Indian tradition and Hindu lore. And my name is one of the precious few elements of my day-to-day life that serves as a welcome reminder to me of where I come from. It strengthens my bonds with my heritage, my family. You know, my father, who gave me my name, he grew up in a small village in South India, where he was raised with age-old traditions and cultural ideals, many of which he passed on to me and many of which I'm passing on to my children. And India is an inextricable part of who I am. And I feel very blessed to be an Indian American. As an English-speaking Christian, though, born and raised in North America, my name is one of those precious few things that highlight my Indian heritage. The second aspect of my identity is my genetic makeup. Our DNA holds traces of not only our recent human ancestry, but also of a much longer evolutionary history. And my genome contributes substantially to all sorts of traits, some prosaic traits like skin color or height, as well as more interesting ones like my competitive drive. Right? And my genome even holds clues about predispositions that I might have to various diseases. But as much as my genetics shapes my identity, advances in science have demonstrated that by no means does it seal the fate of my identity. For example, our environment heavily influences how our DNA works. Individuals with identical DNA sequences can develop different traits and behaviors as a result of how their unique conditions of life have shaped the way that their DNA works. We can certainly get into much more of this if there's interest as the evening progresses, but the key point is that our identities are certainly influenced, but not determined by our DNA. See, science, it provides a set of tools that are useful for investigating phenomena in the natural world. But as powerful as it may be for dissecting planetary motion and battling cancer, it's not really intended for questions like, why did life forms originate in the first place? And we're free to speculate, opine, and have our beliefs, but science is not equipped to answer questions like this. This doesn't itself mean, let me be clear here, that there is an answer somewhere else. It just means that we have to be faithful to what science is, and that we can't extend the purview of science beyond what it is capable of addressing. Science is necessarily agnostic with respect to anything outside of the natural realm. It neither accepts it, nor can it refute it. So the important point here is that science does not constrain us to look only to science for the complete truth about who we are. That little lesson, it's not as though that directly leads us to God. But I think what it does is it helps break down the barriers that might otherwise prevent us from considering the possibility of a deeper spiritual reality. You know, in our day, what is true or what is real is often understood as that which can be proven, usually by logic or reason or scientific method. I think it's really interesting to contrast this with ancient wisdom. In ancient Egypt, the word for truth is mat, which means that which binds all things together and maintains equilibrium in the universe. In Sanskrit, the word for truth is satyam, which means that which supports or sustains our very existence. In Hebrew, I have to be really careful here, okay? The word for truth is emet, a word that is composed of the first, middle, and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet and means that which explains everything. And we've gone from thinking about truth as that which binds all things together in harmony to that which we can prove by the scientific method. In the period we live in of scientific enlightenment and technological advancement, it's introduced knowledge of the natural world at a pace that is staggering and unprecedented in human history. And I'm inspired by this, and I hope you are too, motivated by it and thrilled by it. But have we forgotten that no matter how much reason and science achieve, that it is still limited by the finite capacity of the human mind? Does that not give us even some pause anymore to consider whether there may be realities that science alone cannot illuminate? Blaise Pascal, a 17th century mathematician, argued that there are many ways of knowing. And he is a logician, mind you. And he said there are many ways of knowing that reason knows nothing about. As our science has greatly expanded, I fear that sometimes our view of truth and reality has contracted. And that brings me to the third aspect of my identity, which is wrapped up in the person of Christ. In my own spiritual journey during my undergraduate years, I studied many different faith traditions, including Christianity. And one of the first discoveries I made is that stripped of Christ, Christianity was actually no more or less compelling to me than really any other faith tradition that I studied. It was the person of Jesus that made all the difference to me. He's the supposed hero of the story, but he's naked and broken on a cross. It seemed the antithesis of a hero at first, but what I would learn is that in the cross, Jesus was turning upside down my notions of power. It turns out he wasn't on the cross because he was powerless to stop it. He was on the cross because that's precisely how he chose to exercise his power, to give up his life for the sake of others. As a Christian and one who claims to follow in the way of Christ, I am also called to live a life of self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. I don't always live up to that calling, but it really does shape the way that I think about who I am. So that's a brief look at culture, genetics, faith, and their respective contributions to my identity. So thank you again for the privilege to be a part of this event, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion tonight.
I'm especially interested in the second of your categories, the question of your genetic identity as at least a factor, if not a determinant of who you are. It's a category that to me, that I would have assumed would be, I'm surprised to find that that is a relevant factor in non-Jewish faith, for example, because genetic identity is so tightly connected with Jewish identity in particular, that I hadn't thought about that in other faith communities, right? That to the Jewish community, Jewish identity has to be connected to genetic identity. Either genetic identity that you receive through your parentage and ancestry, or genetic identity that you somehow acquire through conversion. So I wonder if you can reflect a little bit about, we have I'm happy to go into it a little bit more a bit later, but Jewish thinkers and writers and theologians for a very long time have tried to sort of square the circle about whether Jewish parentage or heritage is necessary and or sufficient to determine somebody's Jewish identity. So I wonder if you can reflect a little bit about the role that, let's say, your genetic background makes you who you are, or simply adds to your understanding of who you are.
Should I do that now, or should I?
Yeah, maybe just a brief thought.
Sure. So for me, what I mean by genetic makeup, I'm actually divorcing it a bit from my ancestry, in the way that I think about that and how that informs my identity, as well as my faith, right? So for me, I'm thinking about it more from the perspective of a geneticist who's aware that we are all just a little bit different, right, when it comes to the full DNA complement that is in our cells. And those differences contribute to the features that you can discern on me, right? Like, so those prosaic ones I mentioned, like skin color or height. But I'm also well aware that I have predispositions to various kinds of behaviors or traits and things like that, that I know are partially influenced by my biology, by my genetics. And so what I mean by my genetic makeup contributing to my identity is sort of on a regular basis, I'm keenly aware of the fact that in an important part of why I think the way I think and why I find certain things interesting and others not and things like that are indeed influenced by the DNA that is in my cells. And that is surely the case for all of you as well. So that's really all that I meant by that. Yeah.
So I think I'll reflect a little bit on my own history, my own past, because I think that's part of the conversation that we're having here. So my father came from Iraq, part of the ethnic Christian minority in Iraq, which has a very long and I think noble history in the Middle East. And he came here and he married my mom, who was a Catholic girls' school, all the way up, but was non-practicing. Now, my father was an interesting character. He was a very strong atheist, as it turns out, because of the alignment of the church in that country at the time. And so I was told at a very early age about Santa being not real, and that was sort of a bummer for me growing up. But I think it's really important to say that, where I am now, I am essentially, I think, very typical of a scientist at this point. I'm an agnostic. So typically, I do not feel I need to prove or disprove the existence of God, for instance. I feel I am sufficient to understand the world and understand and learn from others around me, whether they're spiritual or philosophers or scientists. So I try to take wisdom from all sources. So obviously, my views are actually very largely shaped through the Judeo-Christian ethic, right? But it's also shaped by things like Stoicism, which was an early Greek philosophy. So I tend to live my life in what I consider to be a rational, ethical way in which I conduct myself and try not to worry too much about the things I can't control. And that's a big struggle for me from my personal history because just say that when I was younger, I was not always making good decisions in my life. And so I've learned, and you will learn in your life, hopefully, to make better decisions and draw wisdom from all sources. So for me, the reason I wanted to be here and the reason I thank Veritas for inviting me is this is a nice chance for me to interact with people who think about the big questions, not just what gene controls what, but what does this all mean? And so for me, the genetics of life is about what I call emergent phenomena. So the complexity of our mind, the complexity of our DNA is so much more than a DNA sequence. And so for me, we manifest behaviors and thoughts that are emergent more than the sum of the parts, right? And so in a way, I agree that science doesn't know everything and almost cannot know everything because we cannot conceive of things we cannot understand. But I will counterpoise that with the idea that I will look and keep looking, but I don't feel I need to have it. So that's sort of my reflection on your point, which I think is very interesting. But then I think the most important thing I always take is to think about you can learn from everyone in all walks of life. And so as a scientist, I try to maintain my openness to all thought, because I think to do otherwise would not make me a scientist, actually. So that's what I wanted to that's how I reflect upon what you said.
I guess then a question I have maybe for Dr. Sethupathy and also Dr. Shamoo is very much along the lines of what you're saying. Are there ways in which your scientific work itself has caused you to think about life's deeper questions? So I guess alternative ways would be that they're completely compartmentalized or something, but are there ways in which that the work itself that you've done has caused you to think about those deeper questions?
Yeah, only in the sense that I think it's very natural for a question like, why did life forms originate in the first place, right? Those kinds of questions, very natural to ask those over the course of a career in the life sciences, right? Well, why are they there anyway, right? And what you find is that, right, as I was mentioning earlier, we don't really have the tools in science to answer a question like that, right? And so it's not as though that then directly leads me to God, but I think what it does is it helps me to understand what science is equipped to do and what it's not equipped to do. And so at that point, I'm sort of free to explore if there are any other avenues to knowledge for answering that question. Maybe there are none, but maybe there is one. And I think for me, the real critical thing is that working in science helps me to embrace that science doesn't constrain me to look only to science. I think that's really the sort of critical thing for me.
Yeah, I think one of the things that science in some ways is very liberating, because there are things you can test and you can test them. And there are things you can know and you can know them. And there are things which, I hate to sort of channel my inner Rumsfeld here, there are things you don't know and you don't know that you don't know them. There are things you know, right? And that's how it is, right? So I hate to be quoting someone that I'm not necessarily always enamored with, but that's a good quote, actually. And so as a scientist, you test what you can test. But for me, what was special was when I began to understand the complexity and the beauty of life and the specialness of life as a biologist, you really begin to think about the big questions. Why am I here? How did I get here? How did this all happen? And so there's a lot of ways in which science leads you to think about these bigger questions, even though you're looking at something very minute in your laboratory, like we look at very minute things, but it opens up really different universes for us. And so we think really hard about those things. We don't often have answers to those big questions, and science is ill-prepared in some respects to get at questions that you can't propose an experiment for. So you can't, it's hard to prove some things, not just because of technology, but because it's hard to actually frame an experiment. So we, as scientists, want to be open and thoughtful. And I read, you know, for me, like I said, I read Stoicism a lot. I try to think very hard, very rationally. But I know I'm a human being at the end of the day, and I make the same kinds of mistakes and have the same kinds of challenges that everybody else has. So it doesn't make me immune to those challenges of life. Rabbi, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, I wonder, you know, since you brought up your affection for Stoic thought, you know, one of the things that I'm reflecting about a little bit is whether, Praveen, maybe you can comment on this, whether you suppose that the goal of a purposeful moral life is in some way to supersede the body. Right? We talked about the identity that we have that comes from having a certain kind of body, right? A certain kind of biology or genetic makeup, and the kinds of self that we develop because of our values and the things that we learn and the way that we want to move through the world. So I wonder if you suppose that the purpose of a spiritual, principled life is to, like I said, supersede the body, to get past our body's limitations, appetites, hungers, desires. Yeah, so I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit.
That is a great question. I'm not sure I would necessarily frame it in that way. There's a bit of Buddhist philosophy there, which I think is very interesting to talk about, but isn't necessarily the way in which I think about it. And so I'll try to be careful here in the way that I describe, you know, the way that I think about my biological nature and my spiritual nature. Okay. So it is true that I feel as though what makes humans unique, and this is actually, I believe, a conversation point for later, but maybe we'll dive right in, is not so much our biological nature, okay, as it is our spiritual nature. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You know, we've tried for centuries as scientists to make all sorts of claims about biological uniqueness of humans. Maybe it's making tools, maybe it's the ability to form empathy, maybe it's reasoning ability. And the more that we learn, the more that we find that other animals, generally primates, experience or have these kinds of features too. So these quote unquote markers of humanity end up getting a bit fuzzy, right, as to whether they really are clear cut and dry markers of humanity. And so I think it is not so much our biological nature at the end of the day that distinguishes us, in my belief, that it is our spiritual nature. There's a God-breathed spirit And there is a desire to know him, a desire to have fellowship with him, a propensity to ask these kinds of big questions of life. And then as a Christian, I also believe that there is a calling to represent him well, to take care of the world that we're in, and to contribute to the creative processes that he's authored, right? And so it's those things, all of which I sort of wrap up into our spiritual nature, that I think more cleanly delineates us from other animals, as wonderful as they are, but that may not necessarily have those callings, right? So I think those are the things that do ultimately make humans unique, in my view. And so in that way, there is something to me that's special about the spiritual nature that we have been given. But I would not translate that into the body is not good, right? Or that we need to supersede the body, or there's something bad about the body. I think the body is still very good too. And it's actually this integration of the body and the spirit that ultimately makes us unique.
A question specifically for Rabbi Hayon, if that's okay. I kind of picked on them first before, but I'm interested to know from your perhaps perspective in particular, if it's important to know what you believe at all. So why should these folks be thinking about that at all? And if the scientific method, and this is where I think others can jump in as well, can be used to develop or be an assessor of one's belief system, is that the right kind of tool or framework to assess the belief system?
Yeah, I mean, from a Jewish perspective, absolutely. That the Judaism has never been a community of dogma or catechism, right? It's the Jewish faith has always grown and thrived in the study hall more than in the monk's cave, right? That Jewish thought, classical Jewish thought, has always understood that the way to find truth, enlightenment, to fulfill your mission on earth is by learning. And not by sort of swallowing dogma whole, but by asking really hard questions, by challenging your teachers. The greatest triumph that a teacher can have is to raise a student who's smarter than he is, right? Who teaches him something that he didn't know. So I think it's very, very important to connect knowing and doing, probably even above believing. So yeah, I would say for sure. And one more thing, and that the great thinkers of Jewish life, at least from the Middle Ages to today, have been people that came out of the rationalist school of philosophy. They're not, I mean, certainly we have our mystics and we have other folks that come at Jewish belief from other ways, but systematic ethical philosophy has always been very, very important to the development of Judaism as it lives in the world today.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious to ask you that. Do others have reflections, or maybe you do as well, on whether or not the science itself can be used to evaluate belief systems, or it's a large question.
I mean, science, by definition, does not address belief. Mm-hmm. Belief is contradictory, philosophically, in my mind, to belief. To believe is a different, entirely different matter. Mm-hmm. And so science, I would not propose to test belief through the scientific method. I can explore the universe. I can test ideas, but belief, by definition, does not require experimental validation. And so therefore, I would posit that it's actually not something I would want to do. I want to have rational thought. Right. I want to have hard questions, but I don't think I can derive like a method to look at belief in that way. That's my own personal view. So I think there's rational questions, hard questions, but it's hard to test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I could, just briefly, I really enjoyed those reflections on the question of whether it is important to know what you believe. I would say that it is. I think we all believe something, and I think we all bring some kind of a worldview to the table. Now, that might be intentional and well reflected upon and sort of purposeful, or it might be more passive, something we've just absorbed from the world around us, right, just by existing. And I would contend that the former is healthier for two major reasons. One is that when you have an idea of what you believe, you're more readily available to be challenged about what you believe. And I think a tested belief is important, right? Because it leads to the asking of those kinds of hard questions, which I think is really, really important even in the realm of belief, right? And I do agree that the Jewish tradition really holds that up more than any that I know. I think that it is very, very important to have a tested, challenged belief, because then that's how we grow, right? I think that's how we learn and that's how we grow. I think the second reason is we're all gonna face real hard circumstances and challenges in our lives. When we have some kind of a center or a foundation that will help us to kind of reorient us to what we believe are our priorities in helping us make those hard decisions going forward, knowing what you believe can be very instructive and helpful in those times and very centering. And so can science help us to get there? More or less, I would agree with what Dr. Shamoo said, with one caveat that I think with certain kinds of faith like Christianity, which are deeply rooted in historicity. I mean, there are claims that are being made, right, that should be testable in some fashion or the other, right? Not a classic molecular biology experiment, but there are ways in which to examine literature. There are ways in which to, archaeological digs. There are ways in which to study historical texts, all in an effort to maybe examine the historical claims that Christianity makes. And so there are things like that that maybe are subject indeed, and in fact, I went through many of these myself to try to establish the likelihood of veracity, right, of these claims. But at the end of the day, there is a leap of faith that one is taking that is not really scientific in nature.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I was going to push you a little bit on that question about what role research and learning and reason has in sort of testing belief. Because I think you're right. I think that there is, I don't know how to ask this question, but certainly for believers, it matters whether Jesus was a historical person who existed in the world. It matters whether there was a Mount Sinai where something happened. It matters whether Muhammad did certain things and actually was able to hear the word of God, right? These things matter, and it's worth, one of the crises of modern faith identity has been that as we develop new and sharper tools of study in archaeology, in manuscript theory, in genetics, all of a sudden that sort of the circle of faith's mystery gets smaller and smaller. So we wonder whether or not faith can survive as reason grows.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point at the end there, and I wonder if I can take just a minute or two to respond to it. Two things actually that I want to say to one of your first comments and then the final comment. I completely agree with you, although I think it is worth noting that that's more true in some faith traditions than others. So for example, in Hinduism, at least in my experience, it's quite rare that someone really cares about whether something happened or not. It's not that critical, right? Mahatma Gandhi famously said that the greatest teacher for him was Jesus, and someone asked him, if we could prove to you that Jesus didn't exist, would that bother you? And he said, absolutely not, I would still love the Sermon on the Mount, right? Whereas for a Christian, let's say that proof were to come, everything falls apart, right? In fact, it even says in the scriptures that the entire faith rests on the veracity of the resurrection, right? And so there are different faith traditions will interact with the need for historical truth a little bit differently. To your latter point, I think that's a really interesting point. So Stephen Jay Gould actually provided a model of thinking about science and faith. And he was well-intentioned in doing this actually because he didn't want fighting, right? He said, let's all just get along, right? And so what he said was, let's have a Venn diagram with two circles that are non-overlapping, right? And so there's one circle over here, and that's science, that's naturalism, that's things that we can mechanistically understand by doing science, right? And then there's stuff over here that's faith, and that's just in a different realm, and it explains things that science can't. The problem with that model, right, is that, as you say, the more that the more scientific advanced we become, right, the more of the phenomena that we see that we're able to explain by purely naturalistic means. And so then that has the impression of pushing faith out, right? To the point where that circle of science or naturalism kind of like just takes over. But for me, the reality is the model is completely different, where God sits above whatever kind of rectangular space we're thinking about here, okay? And there are those spheres of things that can be explained naturalistically or perhaps not, miracles or what have you, okay? But it's all under the purview of God. To me, something that's explained naturalistically, it doesn't take the wonder of it away from me. I just think, wow, it's really cool that God did it that way, right? So it doesn't take it away and say, okay, well, that's not in God's domain. God's domain is only things that defy natural laws. But that's not actually the reality of the way that I think about my faith. His domain is that which is natural and that which isn't. And I have no clue what percentage is what, right? And maybe one day I'll find out, but it really doesn't concern me. And if we keep finding more and more things that are explainable naturalistically, as I said, he still sits atop of that.
I guess, I feel that in my construction of this Venn diagram, I don't need anyone at the top.
Yeah.
I have the natural world, and there are things I don't understand, the great unknown. And as science expands and our knowledge expands, I don't really feel that, I think that's pretty much an infinite unknown. So I'm not too worried about us figuring it all out in the next few generations.
Yeah.
So I think that the challenge is always there, but for me as an agnostic, I don't need that additional construction. Now I understand that that's my own view, right? But for me, I don't have to have that construction, nor does it seem to be necessary. Again, that's my sort of science side coming out. I don't need to have that there to explain the things that I know and don't know. And so for me, it's an interesting contrast as I listen to this. Like this, I think Stephen Jay Gould was well-intentioned, but I also reject that model because I don't think it's very satisfying for either of us sitting around the table, because I think it makes this really artificial construction that I don't think is really helpful.
Yeah. I think there's a really, can I get 1 minute? Because this is so interesting. I think there's a really interesting point that Dr. Shamoo's making there. And it's actually a conversation I have with a lot of students. They come to me and ask, so at what point did you realize there was a need to invoke God, to explain something? And I actually try to avoid that at all costs, because you really fall into a trap there of something called the God of the gaps, right? Just when you think you need to invoke God for something, and then suddenly there's some sort of material, naturalistic explanation for something. So for me, it has actually never really been about, I really need God to kind of explain all of this for me. It's more that, again, kind of going back to understanding what science is and what it isn't, just freed me up to explore what all else was out there, right, in terms of the supernatural realm. And I was completely fine with the idea that I would walk away thinking, none of it's real, or that you just can't know. I was quite open-minded to all of those possibilities, and so for me, it was never actually really about a need. It was that I was really just struck by the person of Jesus. And I think that motivated me to want to learn more, both from the historical standpoint and from the theological standpoint. What was this whole story about, right? And so I wasn't driven to have God in my model out of a need necessarily, right? Even though Ecclesiastes says that God has written eternity into the hearts of men and women, right? But even though it does say that, it wasn't necessarily my primary motivation, the need to kind of see that God is necessary for all of this to make sense to me. It was more that I was struck by who he said he was.
I've other small questions to ask you. Yeah, so here, how's this one? What is humanity's purpose?
How much time do we have?
Yeah, we got about 5 minutes, I think, left in this section of the program. So I probably shouldn't follow it up with the part B and C. I'm struggling now. So here's part B, just in case that wasn't enough. Okay. What's humanity's purpose? Does your understanding of human origins and Earth's history point to humanity having a purpose? I only asked the question.
Yeah, these are all multi-day, multi-year questions. How much time do we have?
Really get that out there yet.
So the question is about the origins, right? Whether science, in my case, suggests that we have a purpose. Is that sort of the question?
Yeah.
And, I think as a person who believes very deeply in an evolutionary basis for how we evolved on this planet, I think that we evolved towards a direction. We are getting, in the sense, we are more complex, more sophisticated in some respects than our ancestry, and so we have a specialness to us, and so there seems to be a direction of some sort, and I'd like to think that that was true, but I can't prove to you why the chemistry, other than that, you know, to be a more efficient organism is actually the thing that drives our success. And so, you know, you can always make the argument that beetles are more successful than us by numbers. But I do think there's a specialness. We actually do manage and engineer this planet in a way that other animals don't. And so we do seem to have an important role that's sort of a product of our genetics in part, and our what I would call our emergent properties as being really these very social animals, very social organisms, and having these very big constructions, whether they're about philosophy or about religion. These are big things that I don't really think animals have. And that's an empowering thing for us as a species. That's not really answering the question. Rabbi, your shot.
Yeah, exactly.
What is humanity's purpose?
I don't know. I don't know. It's, yeah, I mean, I think, I frankly, even if it's just as a metaphor, I think the evolutionary model makes a lot of sense to me, that we are moving toward increased complexity and specialization, that we become increasingly capable of overcoming our immediate appetites for the good of the community, that as we become more capable of cooperating and collaborating, we increase our ability to survive. I mean, I think those are kind of biological lessons, but they're also spiritual ones. You know, I don't know. Frankly, I think, like, in my daily life, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what is the purpose of humanity. I just try to make sure that I'm moving toward my own purpose of becoming increasingly thoughtful and generous and compassionate, to try to put more reason and kindness into the world.
I really, and you know, as far as does humanity have purpose, I mean, I think that, you know, the rabbi said very, very nicely about some of the biological discoveries as they point to increased not only complexity, but increased cooperative behavior and things like this. And so, you know, I don't want to reiterate all of that. I think it was very nicely said. If you're interested more in that kind of topic, though, I will say Jeff Schloss at Westmont College has written really nicely about this particular topic. And you know, I would encourage you to look him up and read more about that. Maybe what I can do is actually address that part B, and I think I'm going to pseudo address it. And I think it was something like, you know, can science actually tell you something about your purpose, right? And for me, it hasn't been so much science telling me about what my purpose is, but it has been learning that science says that it's surely possible that I do have purpose, right? So it I think establishes a possibility that, again, I can explore more thoroughly through other means. It's not going to definitively say, in my opinion, whether I do or not, although there are these kinds of indicators that are perhaps suggestive, right? But I think the most interesting thing, and this was always a little bit of a kind of difficult point for me, is how do I understand randomness, which is such an inherent part of the way in which we evolve, right? And so many other biological phenomena, things that are happening in our body right now, human development. There's so much underlying stochasticity, right? So how do we understand systems that are where random motion and random behaviors of cells are so critical to the workings of that system? How do we then think about that system having purpose, right? But I think one of the things I've learned over the years in being a scientist is that there are random activities, random processes that are producing predictable, purposeful outcomes all the time. And I won't go into all the kinds of examples that are out there, although I will suggest there's a YouTube video about random motion producing the viral capsid of a virus. Okay, so I'll put that teaser out there and you can go and check it out. And they've got a little kind of visual for you to follow. And you'll understand what I mean when you see it, about how randomness can produce ordered, predictable outcomes all the time. The development of the human body from a single cell in the womb is no different, right? There are a lot of stochastic processes underlying that. But there's a human at the end. A little bit different each time, right, in order to ensure diversity, but there's a human nonetheless, right? And so I think scientists actually really think about randomness quite differently than we generally talk about it in the lay public. And they're quite comfortable with the notion that random or apparently random processes can produce ordered outcomes. And it's in large part because random processes in biology are not occurring in a vacuum. They're occurring within the context of some kind of a system, like a cell. And that cell imposes certain constraints on the random processes, right, in order to eventually produce a kind of predictable, purposeful outcome. So that's the way I would think about that question.
I have a kind of final question for this portion of our event. I'm interested to know from the three of you who are educators what you want for students in terms of how they interface with these questions. So how can these students gathered here, Rice University students, construct meaning and purpose for their own lives, and how can they think about that journey during the college years or university life?
It's a great question. I mean, I can't help thinking back to when I was a Rice student and about what I, like Dr. Shamoo said too, you can't help sort of looking back at the person you were at an earlier stage in life and trying to think of, if I knew now, or why didn't I do X, Y, and Z? I think this is a start, right? I think the invitation and encouragement to ask big and important questions. I think I remember a certain drive for certainty that characterized student life at Rice when I was here some time ago, that it felt really good to know the answers. And so, maybe my advice would be to spend a little more time living in the questions, and that there's a lot more mystery that can guide us than some of the answers.
I think, as the rabbi said, the question is, I think, the important part, right? I think if you want to, the fact that you're here and you're actually thinking about this is a great first step, right? So, but it's a lifelong challenge. I think you never get the answer to this question. At least I actually don't think it's possible. So I think we've all looked back and we've tried every day. I try to improve who I am, bring more kindness to the world, more reason to the world, more justice to the world. And I know I will never be finished with myself, right? So I try very hard to hone my edges to be those qualities I want to be. And I know it's a challenge, and you will have it a challenge. A student should always think and question and ask questions. I think living in the question is a really great way to think about it. I know you'll forget everything I said in biochemistry. I know that. But I also, especially 5 minutes after the exam. But I also know, I hope, that you will walk away knowing how to think more logically, more clearly in this sort of tradition that we were just talking about, the questioning and the reason. So even though you forgot the structure of alanine, you know how to think and learn. And I think that's really a lifelong goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the thing maybe that would be useful to add to that is that, we live in a culture where instant gratification and immediate satisfaction is the sort of mantra of the day, right? And so it makes it that much harder to persevere with hard questions like this, because as has already been said, these are questions that you're likely to be asking and wrestling with and honing your answers to over the course of your lifetime. And what I would say is hang in there. Don't give up on these things because 140 characters won't get you there, right? Although I heard that Twitter's abandoning that. But anyway, perseverance is, I think, really the name of the game with these things. And don't be afraid to explore, right? Don't be afraid to explore. You live in, I've recently learned, one of the most ethnically diverse city in the country, right? And Rice is one of the most diverse universities in the country. I mean, take advantage of that. You're going to be around a lot of different kinds of people. And rather than digging your heels in and getting easily offended by questions and things like that, be willing to be challenged. Be willing to challenge others, but in mutual respect, right? Learning about one another. I think that that's the sort of recommendation that I would give to you.
Thank you, thank you. This was a really thoughtful discussion so far. Thank you so much, really, to each of you. At this point, I'm going to invite Jeremy, who's already standing right here to my right, who will tell you what we're going to do next.
Can we have a hand for the panelists, everyone?
I guess my question is, and this is something, I struggle with, and it's a hard question, so I understand. Do you believe in free will? And if so, how do you reconcile it, with the fact that we are more and more studies and more science is coming out that we're so heavily influenced by our genes and the environment, and also how you reconcile that with the fact that, God created you, if that's your, if God created you, how do you have the free will if he knows everything, so I guess that's.
Catherine, do you want all of them to answer the question?
If
Whoever
they want
feels-
to, yeah,
whoever
I
feels
guess.
led. Yeah, okay. That was a joke.
I have at least part of an answer, which is I think that although your genes make up your predispositions, it might make you more risk-taking, predisposed to certain diseases, it does not free you from your obligations as a human being to act in an ethical and moral fashion. So the last thing I would want is for someone to blame their behavior on their genes. Because no matter what your genes are, you are more than that set of DNA sequences. You learn from your environment, you learn from your family, you learn from society. And so what I would urge is that no matter whether you believe in free will or not, we must exercise our best judgment and not fall back on that as an excuse for, I'm not good at this because of my genes. I think that would be a terrible, terrible outcome of modern genetics.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Yes, I believe in free will. I don't. My understanding of God is not that God is intricately sculpting and scripting every moment of human life. I think that we have agency and autonomy, and our decisions are ours.
Yeah. I fundamentally agree with both of what has been said here. But I think I just want to be honest that I can't sort of lay out the mechanism for you of how free will works, right? It's just something that I think it is a bit of a mystery. I do believe that it exists, much in the same way that Rabbi Hayon just said. But I don't think it's empirically demonstrable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nick. So I was raised as a Christian, and then after a while I drifted away from it, and I've always been content with the fact that, life happened, and that's fine, and there probably isn't a reason, and that's just okay. But especially you seem to be pretty convinced that there was some kind of reason, and I was just curious as to what prompts how assured you seem that there is some reason for life existing, or where that comes from.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll kind of allude what I said a little bit earlier about how I didn't actually come at it with a preconceived notion that there is a reason or that there is purpose. It's more that I arrived there at the end of my journey, right? And I'll share a quote with you of C.S. Lewis that's one of my favorites because it kind of conveys this idea. And he says, I believe in Christianity in the manner that I believe in the sun, not because I see it directly, but by it I see all things. And so the reason I share that is because for me, at the end of my study of the person of Christ and of the Christian faith and how it all came together, right? I mean, just seeing him on the cross the way that I saw him was just the starting point for me. And then I needed to work backwards all the way to Genesis, right? And then to really see that entire storyline and understand what was happening. And as I began to embrace the reality of Jesus in my life, I allowed him to then tell me, where do I find my identity and what is purpose and what is reason, right? So I arrived there after I began to trust in this person. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What do either of you?
I didn't get there, so you know.
Hello, thank you for this night. I'm Daniel. I have two quick questions. One to Professor from Bryce. What's your basis for morality? And if it's relative to what we as a society can come up with, how would you come to terms with the possibility that as a society we see genocide as something that makes sense? Let's just think about that possibility. And then the second question is, for the believers, what would have to happen for you to, for your faith so for you to become an unbeliever, let's say, and for Professor, what would have to happen for you to believe in God?
These are smart students.
Okay, so maybe summarize the first question more succinctly. So say it again.
What's your basis for your morality?
So clearly the basis of my morality, I would say to you, is the Judeo-Christian ethic that I grew up with. I think that I will posit something else, which I think is a little bit more controversial, I think, in this audience, which is in my mind, I actually think that the religion and spirituality is a natural outcome of evolution because it gives a template for collaboration and success. So I actually think that spirituality is a direct product of evolution. We actually are better as a species because we've learned to collaborate, because we've learned to question, because we've learned to solve problems as a group. And so to me, that has appealed to me as a scientist because I can understand that. But that's my own personal opinion.
What would cause you to lose belief? Is that right?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think this is also goes back to my original point that so much of Jewish identity is connected with parentage and family and kind of an ethnic self. So it's very hard for me to think about losing that part of me or changing that part of me any more than I would change the color of my eyes. I don't know. I mean, I can certainly, would it be influenced by events in the world? Yeah, I think so. I'd like to think that I've developed a sort of rational faith that wouldn't be shaken by something horrible happening in my personal life. Or it's a great question. I have to confess, I feel a little unprepared to answer it. I don't know. Do you?
Yeah. If I could actually, and would quickly respond to a comment that Dr. Shamoo made about potentially being a controversial comment. To say that spirituality and religion may be an evolved phenotype, if you will. And I actually think if that comes to pass, and if we find increasing better empirical evidence for that, I think it is not controversial at all, to me anyway, because there may very well be controversial for some people in some circles, but I think the case I want to make for it not being controversial kind of goes back to that idea of how God sits atop of both natural and, let's say, non-natural, supernatural things. He can do things the way that he wants, however he wants, right? And so if he decides that in this evolutionary process, these beings are going to be brought about that are going to be capable of then being able to interact with him and relate with him, so be it. Who am I to say that he should or shouldn't do it that way, right? So just a quick kind of comment on that. With regard to what would cause me to lose my faith, I have to confess that I don't, while I'm constantly looking for good, healthy, robust interactions and being willing to be challenged so that I can, as Christians call it, be Berean, go back into the text and really study and understand and wrestle. I don't know that I've ever really thought about it or framed the question that way in my mind, sort of a bit of a fear-inducing question almost, like you just walk, every corner looking to see if that thing that's going to make you lose your faith is there. So I don't know that I've really framed it that way. Because I feel like it's a bit like asking me what would make you believe that your wife didn't really love you. It's a sort of an equivalent question in my mind. I'm just trying to draw an analogy. And I suppose there are things I could say, but they're like anathema to me, right? And I can't even imagine the possibility of that kind of thing, even though obviously if I were presented with such evidence, I'd have to react to it, right? So maybe one that I can share with you is, I don't know, I mean, let's say that it's unequivocally demonstrated that Christ didn't resurrect, right? As I mentioned earlier, right? If there were no question about it, right? So we're already in the land of serious hypothetical here, right? But just to be able to give you an answer of how critical that actually is, how seriously I take that claim, and how thoroughly I've tried to vet that claim, because it really is, it undergirds everything about my faith.
Firstly, thank you so much for tonight's discussion. And my question is, what are your takes on the theory of evolution and how it points to the plausibility of God's existence? In my experience, for atheists, it's easy for them to say there's so much scientific evidence in biodiversity that just gives more and more plausibility to the evolution theory, which can just nullify the creation story in the Bible, which can nullify, the faith that, God has created things in 7 days and created human beings out of, clay and mud.
Yeah, so I've given lots of talks about half an hour long on precisely answering that question, but I'll do my very best to sort of distill the major points, okay? I completely and wholly subscribe to the evolutionary process. I think that it is, and not necessarily in the classic sense of proving, as though we were able to go back in history and sort of wind the tape again and see everything unfolding before my eyes. That's never going to happen. But in the sense of how we normally do science, which is accumulating evidence in favor of one explanatory model over others. That's really what we're doing in biosciences at the end of the day, right? And the reason why a tremendously large majority, 95% of people in the life sciences subscribe to evolutionary process bringing about the biodiversity we see today, is because of accumulating evidence over the course of many, many years, tens of years, right? That really, that they speak to volumes for that explanatory model over just about anything else that one might surmise. And many, many other possibilities were surmised by scientists, right? But it's scientists themselves that have squelched those in favor of this due to the preponderance of evidence, okay? And so I do subscribe to that. So then I think the question then becomes, well, does that nullify the creation story? And I think it absolutely does not, in my opinion. I think that you can go back to ancient rabbinical teaching, and this is somewhere where Rabbi Hayon would be more of an expert than me. I've only dabbled in reading those. Early Christian thought, contemporary Christian thinkers like N.T. Wright and J.I. Packer and Dennis Alexander and so many others who have very eloquently described, quite apart from any science, forget about the science, right? Just trying to do faithful interpretation of Genesis 1, right? It's a relatively recent phenomenon, this idea that it has to be interpreted in one way. And I say this with all due respect to any interpretations that are out there for anybody, because for me, at the end of the day, it's not a salvific issue. It's not an issue that's the cornerstone of whether or not you put your faith in Christ. However, that being said, I think it can be harmful when we say that only one interpretation is a reasonable or biblical interpretation, when in fact, if you look at the wisdom of the ages in Christian and Jewish thought, that has not at all been the case until quite recently. And that has its origin in all sorts of socio-political happenings in our country in particular, right? N.T. Wright famously says, you realize that very few other places are struggling with this issue. Everybody's just embraced this and moved on, right? And part of the problem is we're exporting this kind of thought, right? Which I think is stifling to really vibrant discussion potentially in the Christian community.
And I just, as a sort of maybe an outsider in this a little bit, I've always been puzzled by that question, because if you actually believe in God and you actually believe in this deep spirituality, then why wouldn't evolution be the way that that's manifested in this world? So to me, I've always been a little bit puzzled with sort of what you were saying, why wouldn't it roll out in this way? So for me, I've always been a little bit puzzled by that question, because it doesn't seem that these are things that can't be reconciled logically.
Also, thank you for having this discussion. So I have two questions just for Dr. Praveen. One is, you said that Jesus died for me. So what do you mean by that, if one day I will die as well? And another question is, what what is your personal evidence that Jesus is the truth?
Wow. Okay. So they're fantastic questions that just would take a very long time to answer because there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, it's an entire journey full of answers that I would give you to that. Let me do my best in trying to give you some kernels of my what would be a much fuller answer to that if we had a few hours. So the second question was, why is Jesus the truth to me, right? And the first question, I'm sorry, can you rephrase that? Can you say it again?
The second question?
The first one?
Oh, you said that Jesus died for me.
Yeah, what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah, so that's a great question because when the Bible made that claim, when I was first reading it, I was completely confused too because I had no idea about all of the history leading up to that event, right? I just sort of dove in to the gospel accounts and here is this man and he's supposedly dying for my sins. What does that mean, right? And so the reason why this would be a long answer is because it's deeply tied to Jewish history. It's deeply tied to the manner in which God interacted with mankind throughout the history of the Israelites, right? But if I can distill it, the essence of it is that God selects a group of people in which to create a special relationship, right? And the ultimate purpose is for them to be able to reflect God to the rest of the world, all right? But there's a kind of schism, there's a chasm between God and man that's created. The exact mechanisms of how that schism occurred, I don't think are fully understandable, other than it comes down to our rebellion and our sin, our inability to sort of use our free will to always do good, right? And so our fundamental inability to do that, to miss the mark, as it were, is really what sin is. And so that sin separates God from humanity. And that separation, the inability to be with God, is really ultimately what death is, right? And so when Scripture says the wages of sin is death, right? Ultimately what that means is that your sin is going to cause you to be separated from God. So that's really what it is trying to say. And reparations need to be made, right? If I do something wrong against my brother or my sister, I need to go repair that damage. But if you're in a broken state already, you're not able to repair it perfectly the way that a damage against God would require, right? And so that sets the stage for humanity needing to repair the damage, but for that damage, for that reparation to be perfect at the same time. And that's just not something you and I are capable of doing. But that's where Jesus comes into the story, right? And so that's where we say, it's important to understand theologically that he's both fully man, because it's a humanity's reparation for that chasm, but that he's fully God, because that reparation needs to be perfect, right? And so it's that entire history, and obviously there are tons of details to fill in throughout that, but it's that history that I think really is important in understanding what it means when someone says, Jesus died for me. I'm so grateful for that question. Thank you for asking it, because there are scores and scores of people that I have met that have gone to church their whole lives, that if you ask that question, are not fully certain, they're like, well, wait a minute, I don't know, right? So it is really good to be challenged by that and to think about what it really means to you. Second question was, why is Jesus the truth to me? Again, for me, it actually started as an intellectual exercise, because to me, it really started more in terms of evaluating the claims of historicity. And I viewed, at the time that I was having this spiritual journey, I viewed the Bible as a biased text. So I said, what kind of extra biblical sources are there that tell me about Jesus being alive even at that time, that he was even a real historical figure, for example? So that was really a starting point for me. And then learning about the texts of Josephus and Tacitus, and then many others, but it actually gets a little bit even murkier, because then people complain about, rightly so, that there's Christian interpolation, that people have mucked around with those texts later and added in various things about Jesus or Jesus's contemporaries. But it turns out that there's a lot of scholarly work to try to very carefully analyze these texts, And I'm not an expert in those, I'm just reading a lot of that scholarly work. And again, not just from Christians, but from Christians and non-Christians alike, really dissecting a lot of these historical pieces. And even if you take apart and discard a lot of the potential sources of interpolation, you're still left with an outline of the character of Jesus and of some of the basic things that happened to him, right? Now, you might still say there are other ways to explain that, and there are clearly very many people who engage that material and say, well, okay, fine, but I have other ways in which to explain, right? But that's where so many other, again, it's like when I do science, it's the accumulation of evidence. Any one of these things, it's not, aha, sign me up, right? But it's the accumulation of the evidence that then tips me, over the edge to begin to say, wait a minute, something is just not adding up here in terms of thinking about this as some kind of legend or fabricated story, right? I mean, you've got the disciples writing the Gospels, okay? And at every turn, they're dim-witted, they don't get it, and it's the women that are exalted, right? They are the ones that seem to actually get it, right, all the way through. They are the ones that see the risen Lord first. They are the ones that get to proclaim the resurrected Lord. And that's an important point, for example, because we're talking about a culture where the witness of a woman in court was not even admissible. It didn't even count, right? And so you had a rather pejorative view toward women, and yet you're wanting to convince people about a movement by exalting women. I mean, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? So those were some of the things that, as I was reading and making inferences and studying, were just not adding up to me in terms of casting it aside as just sort of simple legend or fabrication or, that kind of thing.
But for the second question, is more like, was there something that happened to you personally? So not just looking and reading certain historical pieces, but something that happened to your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sorry, I didn't really finish the answer to that question because I think I got tired of hearing myself speak. But you're quite right. I didn't actually get all the way to answering the question. Those were just some of the historical pieces, for example, were just what kept my skin in the game, right? I just kept getting interested. But once I got to the point where I realized, my gosh, I have to really give this some careful thought. If some of these historical claims or every one that I'm addressing here is quite a serious plausibility, then I have to begin to come face to face with the content of what this guy is saying and not just addressing the historical claims anymore. And so there is a little bit of a switch that occurs there. I do get out of the mode of, checking historical veracity by some pseudoscientific method and get into a more personal realm where I begin to say, what is he really telling me, right? And I actually do remember a moment where he was talking about weighing the cost of being a disciple, and that this is not for the faint of heart, right? This is not so that you can pad yourself with the advantages that you think are going to come with declaring yourself as a believer, right? That if I had to sacrifice, then your call is to sacrifice for others. And so there was a moment in me where I said, do I really believe this? Right? Because it's not a call to an easy road, and I think that's often misunderstood. And there was a moment there that I said, I do believe this.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Justin. Thanks for coming out tonight. This question goes directly to you, Doctor, but if the other panelists could weigh in with your opinions, that would be great too. So I guess I should start by saying that, a lot of stereotypes about Christians in the academic world are, somewhat negative, that they all believe in pseudoscience, the earth is 6,000 years old. And I only say that because I went to a school which taught that. So I guess my question is, do you think that Christians in academia have an obligation to present themselves as more rational, and in that case to lose some of the supernatural mindset which the Bible gives?
I'm not sure I would frame it as they have an obligation. Everybody's got different kinds of gifts and talents, and they need to engage the people around them in different ways, right? But I think that I would say that I would encourage Christians to take the opportunity to engage when that opportunity presents itself. because I have found that I do need to do a lot of damage control to break apart the misconceptions that people have about who I am if I declare myself as a Christian, right? Maybe some of it's true, maybe some of it's not, right? But I enjoy the opportunity to get to know them and relate with them, and actually have a lot of these conversations flow out of a relationship, right? So for me, I think at the end of the day, if there's any interest at all in sort of reshaping what it means to reclaim the life of the mind in Christian communities and things like that, I think a lot of it does have to happen through relationships. I think you need to form relationships, form trust. One of the things I like saying is that trust matters more than information. I can go to an audience that's maybe a bit cold to a lot of the things I might have to say, and if I haven't bothered to get to know them and give them the dignity they deserve and to care about them and where they're coming from, all of the most elegantly presented information isn't going to matter. Trust matters, and so what I would really encourage people to do is establish relationships that are true, that are real, that are genuine, and allow these thoughtful conversations to flow out of that.
So to the other panelists, I actually would ask, would you believe, so I say if you met a Christian in academia, would you think that they would be more credible the less supernatural stuff they believe in?
I mean, I guess I've known Christians in science my whole life, and I've not had any particular thought about whether they should be out there more. I feel that if someone was coming in with, the Earth is 5,000 years old, I would question that, because it doesn't consist with what I consider to be reality. And so, but I've not encountered that much in science. Most of the scientists I meet are, quite sensible, logical, and have very good constructions for the world around them philosophically. So I guess, and my roommate for 4 years in college was a devout Catholic, and I used to try to torture him all the time with thought experiments that would get him to break faith. It didn't work, to his credit. And so in that sense, I guess I don't feel that, people have beliefs, whether they're Hindus or Christians, and I try very hard not to judge people on the basis of those kinds of stereotypes.
All right, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jane, and thank you very much for this discussion. And my question is to Dr. Shamoo, where when I'm a freshman at college, and I found after I came to college, I just discovered or realized that I'm a kind of agnostic. So I just want to ask, what kind of method can you suggest me to discover more kind of agnostic identity of mine, or explore more agnostic ways or something?
No, that's a really good question, and much like I'm going to cop the plea here that it's a very long answer. I mean, for me, I found it through Stoicism and studying essentially those early Greek philosophies, but it also comes from reading reading in the Jewish tradition, reading from the Christian tradition. I actually took a lot of thoughts and a lot of things that I thought were important to make the tapestry of my philosophy and my beliefs. And so there's no one source. I think that part of my belief system and the way how I view the world is by taking this collective wisdom in from many sources and deciding what's consistent with my nature. So I try very hard to to not try to work outside of who I am, try to be a better person, to be consistent with my nature, and to improve my qualities. And I've done that by reading a lot of other philosophers, religious and otherwise. So there's not an easy answer to your question, though I'd be happy to talk to you about it at the reception. But for me, Stoicism was actually the one set of texts that allowed me to understand that I had to become in concert with my own nature to be the person I wanted to aspire to be.
And for the other panelists, I want to ask a question that kind of, do you have a kind of more academic challenge to agnosticism, a kind of challenge to this kind of agnostic beliefs?
It's a good question. I think my own religious identity and I sort of hesitate to use the word ministry because I don't think that's the right word, but my role as a clergy person has really never been connected with trying to convince non-believers to believe. I really, I'm very, very committed to rational exploration of the world and the sources. I think you should read everything you can get your hands on. I think you should read philosophy. I think you should read scripture. I think you should, for me, I got a lot of my sort of inner development came when I was did a lot of reading about archaeology. I mean, for me, that changed a lot of my thinking about history and how do I believe, can I make sense if there is no evidence of X, Y, and Z. I think being a well-rounded citizen of the world is what you're talking about. Read everything you can get your hands on and talk to interesting people all over the place.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. Be voracious in your reading and do not allow yourself to be pigeonholed into what you're going to read. So allow yourself to explore quite tenaciously and broadly. I think what I would also encourage you and every single person in this room, and it kind of reiterates a point that I think all of us maybe at some point made, and that is we should all be interested in growth, right? And ask yourself those hard questions and say, how would I answer these questions? You all have posed very wonderful questions to us. Where does our morality come from, right? Where does it derive? Why is that a good place from which to have it be derived, right? Those are all really good questions, right? And it's okay if you don't have answers to those. But I would say as a part of the desire to grow, right, keep pursuing those questions in the spirit of perseverance and don't give up on those. Because I think those are the kind of ultimate questions. Those are the things that we ask as humans that other animals, I think, don't, right? So.
Another question for Dr. Shamoo is what's the hardest question towards agnosticism that you ever encountered,
Well, I think that's a deeply personal place that you have to go as part of the exploration. I think all of us have touched on the thematic element of the journey and the question, and so for you, it's going to be different than it will be for me or for probably anybody sitting in this room. And so I think what we're trying to encourage you to do is to think hard about the person that you aspire to be and how to get there, right? And so again, like we're saying, being a voracious reader of all the texts, think hard, but you have to frame that to yourself. You're trying to improve yourself, and don't give up. It's a never-ending quest, and you'll have relapses. You'll have times when things don't go the way you want them to go, philosophically or through your thoughts, and you've done things, you're like, man, that just was not what I would, but you have to keep going. You have to keep moving forward. I think we all would want that for you, right? And so there's not a single answer to your question other than the journey is part of it, and the asking of the questions and how you answer them is really critical to this. And you just have to keep plugging away. There is no easy way forward to be the person you want to be.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hey, I'm Luke, and my question is for Dr. Praveen. Okay, so you said you're from a Hindu background, and my question is and you said you feel blessed to have that identity in you. So my question is, how does your Christian faith interact with this background? And do you think it contradicts any part of it? Or if not, how do you celebrate this diversity?
Wow.
That's fantastic. Thank you for asking it. It's something that I've been thinking about for years, actually, and probably a little bit more equipped to answer it now than 2 years ago. And you can check in with me 2 years from now. I'll probably give you an even better answer. But this is my view towards other faith traditions, okay? And again, you're going to notice this theme in the way that I talk about my faith. It really boils down to a person, right? And I don't find that there's really, I think I may have mentioned at some point or the other, the golden rule, for example, right, is in various forms and variations found in so many different faith traditions, and it's not uniquely biblical. I think what is unique to me about Christianity is the person of Christ and the claims that he makes and the kinds of things that he did and the radical kind of life that he calls his followers to. I think those are some of the things that are really set it apart for me. I don't perceive there to be no truth or no good thought in other faith traditions. I think that that there are interesting and important things to understand and that can be brought to the table from many of those faith traditions, because if you think about it, so many of those were born out of a genuine desire to want to know something about God, right? And so even if I think that, fundamentally to me, it's not so much that they are wrong about everything that they're saying, it's that they're missing the person of Christ, which then I think colors everything about the way that we think about who we are, right? I don't mean to minimize the differences and simply say, if you just take Christ and insert him into all of those things, then I would be those things too. I don't mean to say that. I simply mean to emphasize that to me, so much of what's actually different is the person of Christ. And not so much that I perceive I have an enmity toward other faith traditions or anything like that. I mean, to give you an example, Buddha was a Hindu, right? And he was a prince. And he had a fairly sheltered life. And then when he was exposed to the life outside of the palace and he saw the suffering and the, all sorts of terrible things going on, he really questioned the ability of Hinduism to explain that for him. And he started Buddhism. And so I identify with him in a bit, in the sense of, how do we explain these things that are going on? What's the fundamental cause and problem of these things? Now, he ended up going in a little bit of a different direction than what Christ teaches, okay? But I think that fundamental desire to understand why is the world broken, the understanding that it is broken, and then the desire to ask why it's broken, those are questions that bore Buddhism. And I identify with those questions, right? And so for me, it's not just a carte blanche, they're all just bad and evil and wrong. It's really trying to understand that common desire that we all have to understand God and how he relates with us, but that ultimately I find that answer in Christ.
I just want to thank you for putting this on, Praveen. I think you did a beautiful job just explaining Christianity. I have a very similar testimony where I grew up. I got my doctorate degree in reproductive physiology, and it was then that I started to explore all the different, I think we're all born with a universal desire to know God, maybe think that, there is a God. So I started doing the research, and I, too, came upon the fact that Jesus Christ is who he said he is. So I guess my question goes directly to Dr. Shamoo. And you said earlier that there is no one source. And I do appreciate the fact that all you scientists up here today did agree to the fact that the scientific method is not the only way of finding truth. So I'm asking you specifically, how do you find truth outside of scientific methods, such as belief systems, specifically the historicity of Jesus Christ himself? I mean, have you done the research on the man and his claims and his deeds?
Well, on a personal level, I don't actually have the need to have those outside. I don't need to explain the unknown in that way. To me, it's just part of the nature I have not discovered yet, and I will get there, or my descendants will get there eventually. So I actually don't have the question that you're posing in my mind. So for me, I don't know how to answer your question because I don't have it. So I don't have any need to understand, in my mind at least, these questions. Now, as to the historicity of Jesus Christ, I think there's substantial evidence of his existence. But to me, he's a historical figure of great, great quality and great, great humanity. And that's all he is to me.
Okay. I won't go a little bit further, but I think most of us would argue the fact that he didn't claim to be a great figure. He claimed to be the Messiah.
No, I claim he's a great figure.
And then going along with that, going along with that line, what about the resurrection?
First of all, thank you for all this wonderful lecture and all this wonderful forum. And I'll try to make my question brief. I've read Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and originally I was atheist before I came back here. From my army period back in South Korea, but after coming here, I've become somewhat agnostic. But my question is, belligerent atheists like Richard Dawkins often argue in his books and lectures that the purpose of life is, or the purpose of human body is basically the proliferation of DNA. In other words, that our human body is carrier of DNA, and DNA is using us to proliferate itself. And there is no such thing as spiritual purpose, innate spiritual purpose, but the purpose is made by ourselves. We have our own free will. Then, as Christian or as believer in any other religion or as agnostic, can humanity or human beings have spiritual purpose or some kind of higher purpose separate from God's will, or can it have spiritual purpose by itself even if God created us? In simpler words, can we have purpose separate from God's own will?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think you can certainly build a case for a non-theistic purpose to life. Absolutely, I think that if the purpose of the human animal is to replicate itself, you can make an argument that it's a rational activity to build and sustain a society that takes care of the weak, places curbs on the power of the strong, that uses resources to protect all the members of the society. Right? You don't need a belief in God to build a rational case for a kind, sustainable society. And I would advocate for getting to a belief in God through that way, but I don't know. Maybe you have a different take on it.
Yeah, it's just such a neat question. A lot of really good questions today. I appreciate it. I think what your question prompts me to do is to think about purpose as a multi-layered entity, right?
Yes,
it's not just sort of like a point to achieve and say, I'm there and then I've achieved purpose, right? Mm-hmm. I think there are different layers of purpose. And so there may be a biological purpose that we have, right? I mean, we certainly, in a way, you can kind of tie this to the spiritual, because Scripture says multiply, right? Or be fruitful and multiply over the face of the earth. And so at some level, part of our purpose is simply just to procreate and to continue onward, right? And that can be fairly well described just biologically. We know mechanistically how that happens. We sort of have an evolutionary understanding of why it should happen, right? So we can define biological purpose like that without invoking God or talking about Christianity or any other faith tradition for that matter, right? But it doesn't, I think the key point that I keep coming back to over and over again is that doesn't say anything about whether there's another layer to purpose or not. It's just sort of agnostic with respect to that. And so there's other kinds of work to do to then determine whether there are other layers and what you think those layers are, right?
Nice.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So this whole lecture has been a lot about asking big questions, and I've had one big question that I've had for a long time, and I haven't found a satisfying answer, so I'm wondering if you can answer this for me. So, when I was reading the Old Testament, there seemed like there's a lot of glaring problems with it that just didn't seem like they could be solved well. For example, like there's a story of Nadab and Abihu. I'm not sure if any of you remember that story? Okay, well, I was just like totally flustered by like how that story ever could be like a metaphor for something that could be like something to help you in your life, and for like putting witches to death. And obviously there's no like ideas of witches, all those things. It seems like it's irreconcilable with the defensive claim that some people or some Christians would say like, oh, that's just a metaphor, that I don't take that literally. But if you can see that those are problems that don't actually seem like a God would inspire people to write that down and be good for people, how can you separate what's literal from what's metaphor in your point of view? And then how do you know if the Bible is holy if it has these glaring problems?
All right, so let me just try to make sure that I got the question. So reading the Bible, which is supposed to be pure and lofty and beautiful and full of soaring spiritual wisdom. What happens when you come across stuff that seems brutal or harsh or unfair, right? So it's mostly about the content, not about, let's say, the composition of the book, right? What do you do with the non-rational or the seemingly problematic texts in the, let's say, 3/4 of the book of Leviticus, right? What do you do with that, right? Well, you can do, there's lots of different techniques to figure out how to make sense of it. You can say the whole book is worthless and it's no more holy than any other Bronze Age composition, and so we can read it because it's interesting and pick out the things that are nice. You can read it as metaphor, right? You can say that when the Bible instructs you not to mix two different kinds of fabrics in your clothing, it's not talking about your clothes, but that's a metaphor for different kinds of inappropriate mixtures in your life. You can sort of go the fundamentalist route, which is that if we don't understand it or if it seems nasty to us, it's because we're limited and our perspective and our insight is not as great as God's. You can pick any sect or denomination or religious movement in the world, and there's lots of different, let's say, hermeneutic tools that you can use to make sense of it. We might have 3 different answers, but I'll sort of give you mine. I read the Hebrew Bible as a holy book. I do treat it differently than I do the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Code of Hammurabi or anything else from the ancient worlds. And I think that it came to us because human beings wrote words on paper. And at some point, there's human elements that made their way into the text, and it's very difficult for us to sort of strain out what came from the mind of God and what came from the hands of human beings. I don't think the fact that there's a record of human transmission of Scripture makes it less important or less holy, but I think it makes me feel a little bit more forgiving of some of the stuff in there that's morally troubling.
Yeah. I think there's actually a lot in your question, which, again, I keep saying this, I feel like a broken record. Really good question. And I think it's a lot of people have this question. It's not asked as frequently as I think people actually have the question. So I appreciate your perseverance in standing in line and asking it. Okay. Maybe 2 things, and over time, who knows, I might have a 3rd or 4th, but 2 things I think I want to say in response to your question. One is, there is a sub-question in there of how do you read the Bible? And boy, that is, I wish a lot more of us wrestling with that question, even in the Christian communities, than we really are, or even in Jewish communities, and I actually think there's a better tradition of that in Jewish communities than there is in Christian communities, in my current understanding of things, because it really takes work. It takes work. It's not just something that you just falls into your lap, right? And I think this is one of the many reasons why Jesus says, love the Lord God, not only with your heart and soul, but also with your mind. It takes your mind, right? You've got to really do some of the hard work. And it turns out there are a lot of literary devices that we know about from ancient Near Eastern texts or Hebraic texts and things like that, and you can try to deconstruct what the intention of the author was, right? And so when people ask me, do you take the Bible literally? And I say, well, if you define literally as what is the intention of the author to the best of my ability, then yes. If you take it as like, I'm just not going to accept there's any poetry or observational language or rhetoric or whatever else, then no, right? But my goal is really to try to understand what is the author's intent, right? And so that really requires an understanding of Near Eastern writing, and you don't have to be an expert in these things, but it does require understanding these things at a more than cursory level if you want to dig in, right? And a lot of people have done this and done a lot of the hard work to say, it really looks like this is being presented as a polemic. It really looks like this is an eyewitness account. It really, right, based on clues from the text and, other kinds of things, right? And it's not a hard and fast thing. There should constantly be debate about that, right? And in terms of how we're interpreting, and we should tread very carefully because we do believe it as a sacred text. And so we should, just as much as we don't want to impose something, we don't want the Bible to make it say something that it isn't. So we should be very cautious in that. So I appreciate the question, and it basically is, the answer is it takes a lot of hard work, but it can be done. Okay. The larger question that I think you're getting at is, these to us, what appear to be morally questionable, even repugnant, let's be honest, okay? Things that we see in the Old Testament that are everything from head scratchers to, oh my gosh, I can't even read on, right? And if we're honest, like, they're all there, right? It's partially what makes me really grateful that I started with the New Testament, right? And here's why I say that, okay? Because I'm not sure that I really would, because I still don't understand some of those things, okay? And I'm a lay preaching elder at my church, and I preach largely from the New Testament, and there's an Old Testament scholar in our church that really helps to dissect out some of these things, and there are already a couple of things that I've had aha moments about that used to really trouble me, right? So those kinds of things really help me to understand, okay, there are ways of thinking about this, right? Sometimes it really is just, maybe this is reflecting the finiteness of my mind or the finiteness of my morality. And I'm putting God in a box by saying, God, you should be following these rules and you're not, and so I find you deplorable, right? And in a way, it's like, this is sort of a way to deal with some of that text that is even taught, is like, you can't put God in that box, right? But what I want to say is that for people who aren't believers, that sounds like a cop-out. And I want to be honest about that. I think it can sound like a cop-out. But here's where the rubber meets the road. I don't even understand everything about my wife, right? There are some things that she does that are just plain old head scratchers for me, okay? But if in the heat of the moment, if there's a snap decision that needs to be made and she says to do something and I can't for the life of me figure out why we ought to do that thing over about 30 other things I can think of, in that moment I'll trust her, because there's a depth of relationship that's been formed where I say, I do not get that, but let's go with it for right now. We can circle back to that later and say, what were you thinking, right? But for now, I just need to roll with this because I trust you. So there's an element of trust here that I think is really critical. At the end of the day, I am not going to understand everything about the way God has done certain things. Sometimes it even deep down bothers me a little bit, right? But I come back to this idea that he's really proved himself to me. And there's a tremendous amount of trust that has developed over the course of many years of developing the relationship through that text. And I come back to that and say, is the trust strong enough for me to go through this and say, you know what, I don't get that, but I'm willing to trust you about this, and maybe one day I'll figure it out, and one day I'll find out, but maybe I'm just not capable of understanding it right now. And I don't think I would have very, very much ease in doing that if I had not already built a sort of relationship that allowed me to have trust.